Hey everybody, welcome to today's update on Daily IoT. On today's episode, I want to talk about this idea of test firmware. And this is something that I've been thinking a lot more about in the last week. It's really been brought to the forefront about how I need to have some separate firmware that is dedicated just to testing the hardware. And the reason this came about is last week you saw some of the episodes. I was testing things like the charge and P-good outputs from the power circuitry on the on my PCB here, and trying to figure out what things work, what things don't work, so that I can get to a point where I'm ready to order a production run of all this stuff. I need to get the ball rolling on this because there's lead times on PCB fabrication and assembly, and Agility asked me a really good question of, well, what's stopping you from ordering 100 units right now, even though my firmware is not even close to being done. My firmware for the actual product is out a little ways still. I got a lot of work to do there. But they had that good question of like, well, but if the hardware is all fine, why don't we just order them now and you can have all the units, and then as soon as the firmware is ready, you're ready to go on sale immediately. And that was a really good point, but it also made me think of, I don't actually have a really good test framework set up to test the hardware on the printed circuit board. So when I did all that testing last week to make sure those outputs and things were working, I was just going into my existing firmware, commenting out the main flow and just adding some junk code, throwaway code of just like, is this working? Because I don't have, eventually those things will be built into my firmware, but they're not yet. And it really made me think I need to have a separate dedicated firmware that just tests all of the hardware components that are on the board to make sure everything hardware-wise is working. It doesn't matter what my product firmware does. That's all just using the hardware facilities that are on the board to do something specific, like display stats of NHL players. And so this also came up last week when I was talking to the local assembly house, when I said, hey, do you do like a couple of boards as a test to make sure that your quality meets my needs and standards? And they said, yes, we do. However, what we would really like is for you to get back to us as soon as possible, because we would want to leave the machine set up. And so we need an answer right away, like same day, whether our quality is good enough and do you want us to make another 99 of these things? Which makes sense. They attach all of my components to the pick and place machine and set up the ovens and configure them and all that stuff to do my specific product. And so they don't want to do all that effort, make one board, and then take it all apart again, and then let me get back to them. Now, that's certainly an option and is what is going to happen if somebody overseas or out of state is doing it for you. It's not reasonable to get a same-day answer. But here locally, the request was, ideally if I could be down there at the assembly house, this comes out of the oven and it's ready to go. If I could hook it up to a laptop or something and run a bunch of tests right there to say, yep, everything is working as I would expect, go ahead and make 99 more. And so to do that, it would be really nice if I didn't just have a bunch of cobbled together stuff of, let me comment out some stuff in my firmware and rewrite some things and now let me run it through. It would be nice if I just had a fixed firmware source code, separate repository that is literally just, can I connect to the P1 module? Do I get serial output? Does the Wi-Fi work and connect? Can I display something on the e-paper screen? Is everything output-wise charge P-good from the charging circuit working as I expected? And just run through all of these tests. Is the RGB LED working? And so just some firmware that its sole purpose is to test everything electrically that I can on the board, give me a good pass, no pass, and then I can tell them, yes, that looks good. And not just for assembly, but then when I have 99 more made up and I get those back here, I'd also like to run that through here at home as QA to say, yes, everything's working as I would expect, because even if that first one comes out, doesn't mean that all 100 would. And so anyway, just this idea of I need something separate. I can't, right now they're tied together and I'm doing a comment, uncomment thing, whether I'm in test mode or non-test mode, to answer questions about this, and just really feeling like I need to get away from that. And again, this is another difference when you're going from maker to product. This is never something I would consider in a maker project. Any testing is just happening on the fly, right in the firmware that I'm writing, but trying to balance schedules and getting hardware before my firmware is finished, what's a good way to do that? Well, if I could just write a simple test firmware, then I can keep that piece moving forward. The assembly and fabrication of the boards. Even though over here my firmware is not done yet, I can still keep things moving forward if I just write some simple test firmware to get some questions answered on this side. And so just another thing, again, different from between maker and product and the things that you have to think about. And so one of the things I'm going to be working on right now, I've sort of tabled completely working on the firmware, the main firmware, to get now working on the test firmware and getting that all squared away so that I can answer questions quickly about whether printed circuit boards that I get from whoever, whether it's local assembly or overseas or out of state, that I can get answers very quickly. Yes, everything is working as I expect, or no, here are the problems that I'm experiencing that aren't happening right, and then those can be debugged. And so that is the update for today, what I'm working on. Question of the day. I know there's some ways to do actual hardware interface testing through JTAG. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to take the approach of custom firmware. If you've done any testing on hardware products, what is your favorite approach for doing that? Do you create a separate project like I'm talking about doing? Is it wrapped into your existing firmware project, or do you use some other approach altogether? Stick it in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Also love hearing from the people that are reaching out, sending emails. Keep that up. If you're new and subscribe to the channel, or even if you're not subscribed, send me an email, kevin@sidwar.com, to say, hey, I love hearing from people and getting to know people and where they're from. And it's just really cool to see all the different people and places that are tuning in to watch the journey here. And so again, thanks so much for watching Daily IoT, the show where together we're learning how to make the Internet of Things one day at a time.